Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest Great Lakes area agronomist, and I'm happy to welcome you back to another edition of the Golden Harvest Agronomy In Action podcast. So we're sitting here on the 1st of May, and across Michigan, northern Indiana, and northern Ohio, we woke up to some cooler than desired temperatures, and some folks even seen some snow in the air around the state line. Now, in fact, from north to south, we saw thermometers ranging from the mid to lower 30-degree mark, with even colder weather forecasted for tomorrow morning. Now, unfortunately, it's just that classic Great Lakes spring where, one day we're thinking about running the planter, and the next we're wondering if we need to dig out the winter clothes again. Now, today, I've got a few important topics to cover. First off, we're going to talk about what this cold weather and frost in places means for the few acres that actually are out of the ground. Now, secondly, we're going to dive deep into the unfounded panic that I can't believe I'm already hearing about, a question regarding switching out corn and soybean maturities. And finally, we'll touch on some pretty high levels of black cutworm and true armyworm flights making its way into our area this year. So, grab a cup of coffee and let's talk agronomy. So, first things first, let's talk about this morning's cold snap. I know most of us are still waiting for just the soil to even dry out enough to get seed in the ground, so we really don't have a massive amount of corn or beans yet emerged. But, for those of you who did get an early jump on the planting season, you're likely looking out the window with some concern. Now, here's the rule of thumb. We need to get down to 28 degrees Fahrenheit for about 4 hours to get that real danger zone out there for our young soybeans. So I think most of us should be in pretty good shape this week. Of course, the concern is always that, unlike corn, a soybean's growing point is right there at the top of the plant. So once it emerges and that tissue freezes, those plants are toast. Now, don't go out there and tear up a damaged stand today. As we all should know by now, we have to be patient. Just like my mother used to say, Charles, patience is a virtue. Now, no matter how much we may want to rush the replant decision, it always takes a few days for the plant to kind of show its hand. We need to wait for some sunshine and some warmth so that we can see if that growing point is still green and viable or if it's turned to mush. Only then can we pull out the replant charts to determine if it's worth tearing up or leaving that existing stand. Now, corn, of course, is a different story. Corn's a tough character this early in the game because its growing point, of course, stays tucked safely below the soil surface, until it reaches that V5 stage. Now, usually a frost, it just burns the leaves on these young, tender plants, making them look pretty ugly, but the plant will push through it. Now, one interesting thing to watch for in determining if we will actually lose stand due to cold weather is the air movement. Now, have you ever noticed that the edges of a field, especially near a woodlot or even some tall grass, always looks worse after a frost? Well, that's because that stagnant air allows that cold to just settle. A slight breeze actually mixes the air and keeps the temperature right at the leaf surface a few degrees warmer. It's the same reason our neighbors in the fruit business up in Michigan use those massive fans in their orchards. They're just trying to keep that air moving. So, if your field is tucked behind a windbreak, that's probably where you'll want to scout first for damaged plants. Now today, is May 1st, and in a normal year, we'd like to have a few acres under our belt, but this year, the planters have mostly been parked. I'm already getting phone calls asking, hey, Charles, should I make the call to swap out my full season corn hybrids maybe for something earlier? What's really crazy is it's usually not until after May the 20th that I start to get those first calls. But for some reason, maybe it's because all the warm weather we had in April, I'm already starting to get these questions. So before we make an emotional decision based on the calendar, let's take a look at some of the Golden Harvest insight data that our researchers team has pulled together over the last few years on this topic. So let's start with the math of delay. On average, we only lose about 1 bushel for every 10 days of planting delay prior to the 10th of May. That's a really tiny penalty at about 0.11 bushels a day. It's almost negligible. Now, once we hit May 10th, the Midwest states, they see a penalty that does ramp up a little bit, closer to 1 bushel a day. For Michigan, I believe that's more like probably May 15th or 20th before we see that increase in yield loss for each day of delayed planting. Plus, we've learned over the years that corn needs less heat units to get to maturity when planted later. Part of this is physiological, and I believe a big part of it is just the fact that corn planted in April or even May 1st, it may take 2 weeks or longer to emerge, while that corn planted May 20th, that may only take 3 to 5 days to emerge, depending on the temperature and how long it takes to accumulate that 100 to 120 units of heat needed for emergence. Now, we ran the numbers using a $4.50 grain price and a 10-cent per point of drying cost, and over 41 trials, the yield benefit of staying with full season hybrids outweighed the extra drying costs of that all the way through the middle of May. Now, if we get later in May, then we can talk about moving those fullest season choices to maybe a hybrid that is 4 to 7 days earlier in relative maturity. Keep in mind that if you jump to a really short season hybrid too early, let's say 8 to 10 days earlier than your area's maximum, then you might get drier grain, but you could also leave a lot of profit on the table because of the yield potential oftentimes just isn't the same. Now, university experts from Michigan State, Ohio State, and Purdue all generally agree that staying the course until May 20th or even May 30th, which has traditionally been my rule of thumb. Of course, unless you do have some specific bottlenecks, maybe you don't have access to a dryer or you got a specific delivery contract, unless you have those things, let's stick with those higher yielding full season hybrids that you picked out last winter. They were your first choice for a reason. Now, as for the same question with soybeans, the answer is an emphatic no. Soybeans, they're a completely different animal than corn. While corn runs on a heat unit clock, soybeans run on a light clock. It means, we call that photoperiodism, and, they start to trigger their reproductive stages based on the length of the nights. Yes, I know some research from the more Midwestern states suggests that planting a fuller season bean is the answer if you're really planting late, but, here in our neck of the woods, experience has shown that staying with your original maturity throughout the planting season is the best practice. Now, if we get into June and maybe July and we're still trying to get beans in the ground, we can talk a more detailed strategy at that time. Now, finally, while we've been waiting for the ground to dry out across Michigan, northern Indiana, northern Ohio, these southern winds have been busy bringing in some uninvited guests. Ohio State University's monitoring traps are starting to pick up significant numbers of black cutworm and true armyworm moths. Now, if you're putting corn in the ground this week or next, that crop's going to emerge right as these larvae are looking for their first meal. Now let's look at the data from the LEP monitoring network for the last week of April. We're seeing a real spike in black cutworm and true armyworm activity. If you're in northern Ohio, many of your averages are well above the threshold of 7, some as high as 32 moths for black cutworm. And Fulton County clocked in an average of 60 true armyworm moths per trap. Remember, these moths, they don't stop at the state border, so I suspect numbers in Michigan are also high this year. Now, the black cutworm moths, they're looking for broadleaf weeds like chickweed and purple dead nettle to lay their eggs, while the true armyworm, they're looking for grasses. So if you've got rye cover crop or a lot of grassy pressure in a no-till situation, then you too are at risk. So once those eggs hatch, we've got 28 to 35 day window where those larvae go through their growth stages. Now, if your corn is emerging into a field that had some green in it, even if you've since sprayed it, those larvae are moving from the weeds right onto the only living things in those fields, your corn. Now, we need to be scouting these fields from emergence through that V6 stage, especially if they're, not planted to a hybrid containing the Agrosure trait. Now, when scouting, look for notched leaves or plants that are actually literally cut off at the soil surface for black cutworm. And for true armyworm, you're looking for a ragged-looking leaf feeding that starts from the edge of the leaf margin and works its way inward so that the only thing left behind is the plant's midrib. Now, if we start getting reports of feeding here as we go through May, we will take some time then to discuss the economic spray thresholds at that time. So in conclusion, I'm going to wrap things up today. First of all, don't panic over the frost and cold weather. Let's give any emerged soybean plants a few days to show us if they're going to grow out of anything or if they're going to die off. As for corn, just remember it's tougher than it looks. Secondly, it's the 1st of May. We have weeks before we need to even think about switching corn hybrid maturities. And for soybeans, don't even think about it unless we maybe start talking double crop beans in July. And third, with moth flight numbers up and the chance of having small plants to be fed on in 30 days, we'll need to stay vigilant this spring for scouting and be ready to take action if necessary. Now, if you're feeling the pressure of the calendar over the next few weeks, just give your Golden Harvest sales rep or myself a call. We can walk you through the GDU math for your specific farm and make sure we've got a solid plan in place. Thanks for tuning in to this week's Golden Harvest Agronomy in Action podcast. Stay patient, stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the field.